Okay, this is going to be the automation video tutorial. This will be video number 1. We're going to discuss basics of automation, history of VCA automation. So automation is simply any time that any parameter, could be volume, panning, mute, and plugin automation, plugin parameters can be moved by the computer in this case. So rather than having to grab a knob and a virtual knob in the case of Pro Tools and move that knob in real time yourself during a mix, we use the computer to do that job so that we don't have to do anything. In fact, when you bounce, you're locked out of the computer anyways, so you need the computer to be in control of making those moves for you. Now, as I've said in the past, I've been particularly critical of Pro Tools implementation of automation, mainly in the case of how channel automation is implemented for the various tracks. So what I tend to do is not actually use the volume faders for automation, the channel faders for automation. And the main reason for that is that once you start to automate volume on any of your individual tracks, the individual track faders, once you start to do that, then you no longer have access to the ability to trim from the faders. You basically lose the faders. Let's go ahead and do just a quick, easy example of that. I'm going to go ahead and put Pro Tools into a write automation mode, and we'll just write a little bit of automation just to kind of demonstrate that. And in this case, I'm just going to use the channel fader to write the automation. Okay, I'll play that back. As you can see, there's on the front page there, what I've done to display the automation is to change the view mode here from waveform to volume. And now I'm just going to hit play, and you can see the tambourine gets louder and softer when you see the automation. Now that's all well and good. Let's put it into read mode. We'll talk about the modes in a second. And so now if I just simply want to, these moves are great, but the overall volume of the tambourine might be a little low. If I want to trim it up, I can no longer do that from the fader. I'm locked out of the fader. The fader is now only by control of the computer, the automation lane. I can no longer trim using the fader, and that is where I part ways with Pro Tools implementation of channel automation. This is really the main reason for implementing both VCA automation strategies and something like a tactile interface such as the artist mix. So let's go ahead and just talk about the different modes. We've got off, which is the automation is not working. So if I start playing, you can see that it's ignoring the automation. So that's off. If you basically want to get your control of the fader back, you can always just turn the automation off, and now I've got control of the fader again. Okay, so that's one thing you can do, is just simply turn the automation off. The whole point, though, isn't to create automation and then turn it off, right? It's to use that automation. So again, read, that plays back the automation. Now it's using the automation. And then we have the write modes. Okay, so there's touch, latch, and write. Now, latch I don't really use very often. I use touch and I use right, and then we'll talk about trim in a second. So let's just look at touch. If you already wrote some automation, what I can do is, let's open up a floating fader here. Okay, what I'm going to do is okay, so here we're going to press play, and you can see that it's reading the automation. I'm in touch mode. So now if I go ahead and just touch the fader while it's running, it'll, if I can grab it, all right, got it. Now, see, I'm writing new automation. If I release it, it returns to the old automation. So that in this case, it was just a flat line there. So that's a way of updating the automation. Now, if I go into write mode will just simply overwrite what was already there. So if I press play now, it's just going to start recording over that at whatever level it was at, and then I can write new automation. Okay, so those are the two main. Latch basically is similar to touch in that it will only start to write when you touch it, and then it will basically write at whatever level past that point. So I don't really use that often. Touch and write are all we really need to do. Write is basically, record. It's just going to record over whatever's there, and touch allows you to punch in basically on the fly. So if I put it into touch, it's going to just read it. It's reading it. Then I can grab it and add, and I can release it. It goes back to wherever it was. Okay. So that's touch, and that's actually the mode I use the most. Now, trim allows you to bring the overall automation up or down. So if I trim it, here, let's do this. Now you can see that the fader, it turned to a yellow color and then went to 0, because that's basically going to be relative to 0. So I'm trimming relative to 0. So now if I just play this and I grab the fader and bring it down, it's going to trim it down to there. And then if I release it, it's going to go back to wherever it was. Now what that did is I just basically trimmed it down. Now if I want to, let's say I want to trim this little gully up a little bit, I can let it roll, let it roll, let it roll, then trim this up, release it. Now it's going to basically bring that up a little bit. So you can kind of play with the combination of trim and overwrite, touch or write, etc. Another thing that you can do is you can always get your handy dandy pencil out, and if you feel like, I could, at this point, now that I've got an idea of what the automation curve is supposed to be, you can always go in and just redraw it to what you actually want it to be. You can kind of just smooth it out yourself manually with the pencil tool, which I find myself doing all the time. And then, of course, if you want to just do something linear, like let's just say you want to just have a fade in over the entire course of the tambourine, you can easily just draw it in with a straight line. Okay, so those are all the modes of automation, but again, we're just basically automating right on the track. And again, as I said earlier, let's go back to just basic read mode. If I'm in this mode, once I start to automate something on the channel, I can no longer trim it from the channel. Now, the other way to trim is to just use the trim tool, which is this guy here, and you can actually trim up or down. Let's do this. Okay, so if I wanted to say trim it up or down, say a client comes in, they want, that's great, that move on the tambouриne's great. Can you bring the whole thing up, bring it up 2 dB or bring it down 2 dB or whatever, so you can trim it this way. But trimming it this way is a pain. It's, you have to switch to the edit screen. You have to open this lane up. You have to do, 5 or 6 steps to trim it. When I'm mixing, I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to screw around with this page like this. I just want to grab my fader and bring it up 0.5 dB or bring it down 0.5 dB. So what I tend to do is I'm not really doing broad moves like this anyways. The whole point of what I call moves automation, which is what this whole tutorial is really about, is doing rides or moves, whichever word you prefer. And the whole point of that is that there might be, say, something like a vocal or guitar solo or any kind of much more dynamic type of part, and that needs to have a little bit of a dynamic or volume nudging here and there. There might be like a word that should come up a little bit, or a phrase that should come up a little bit, or something like that, to add a little bit of dynamics to a mix, where you're just trimming it, something up, a couple of dB here, or a couple of dB there. It's not about doing big dramatic things, although you can do that, but of course, keep in mind that in an analog mixing situation, if these tracks are feeding the inputs to a desk, you're going to change the sensitivity to the inputs of the desk and the sensitivity to the inputs of any compressors that are inserted, should you be doing that type of mixing. And so you want to be careful about exactly how drastic or how dramatic the automation coming off of your channels is. You want to make sure that you've already trimmed the maximum gain before it's coming out of Pro Tools into an analog situation. And so again, this is meant as a tool to be used for micro adjustments.